Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Human Echoes recap for Legion, Season 1, Episode 2, Chapter 2. And let me just start off with this by saying that I am much more on board with this episode for some reason than I was with the first episode. I like the first episode, but I felt kinda lost, and here... maybe it's just because I was less tired. This is not a good show to watch when you're tired, and I was a little bit on the edge of being tired last week when I saw the first episode. Or maybe it's because it's a little bit shorter this week, but I was able to sink my teeth into this just a little bit more, even though the show is not really doing anything different, right? It's still got this very weird, very dreamlike, literally dreamlike vibe that it's intentionally going for all the time. It's always trying to keep you thrown off your feet. You're always feel like you're sort of in that zone with David, right? That you're going crazy watching this. But for some reason, it just worked better for me this week. Maybe the first episode just kind of inoculated me to the weirdness a little bit and said it got me on the same page. And now that I am on the same page, I'm really digging this. It's still really hard to recap in a synopsis style way, but we'll give it a shot. We pick up this episode essentially in the same place where we left off the previous episode. David is on a boat traveling upriver. He's with the same group of mutants that rescued him from the facility where he was being held by the government, and he's going to a place called Summerland. If you believe that any of this is real, which I do not. Real in a physical, literal sense, I do not believe that most of these people are actual separate entities from him. I do believe that they are all separate personalities living inside of his head. And I think we get a little bit of evidence towards that, in addition to some really interesting subtle bits of dialogue of people kind of poking at him, sort of saying using I and we interchangeably, and just the way that maybe this is confirmation bias. It's possible that I'm completely off base here and I'm just reading things into this. But the way people talk to him and the specific dialogue options used really seem like they lend themselves to the idea that maybe this is all happening in his head, and maybe these people are all just trying to get him a little bit more put together and on board with what's going on so that he can actually use his powers to the full extent that they're able to be used. But it felt that way to me. And the one... I would say, if as concrete as anything in this show can be, the one concrete piece of evidence that I would point to is that now we see a character modifying memories. And we saw that happen in the last episode, right? With the black guy whose name I've forgotten, the memory artist, as the leader of this group of mutants calls him. He takes David into some of his memories and tracks back through some things that he has done. They're trying to get him to come to terms with the fact that he is not crazy and that he in fact has powers. And it's an interesting dynamic because obviously he does have powers, right? We've seen him be telekinetic. We've seen him blow up entire rooms and smash a bunch of glass, and he can clearly do stuff with his mind. However, he's also still pretty crazy because he's seeing, in addition to whether or not you buy into this idea that all of these things are fragmented manifestations of his psyche, the things that they are taking him back to, these supposedly unaltered memories, have gaps and flaws and the yellow-eyed demon again in them, and all of that stuff lines up in a weird way that makes you think he's not... even these other people who understand him better than maybe anybody understands him are still not fully on board with the extent of what's going on with this guy. And it's an interesting mystery because on the one hand, you get more answers. You start to see that his memory can be modified and that he can modify it and that other people can modify it. And that answer introduces a lot more questions as well as far as what we can believe and what we can't believe. But it's still out of balance because even these memories that he has, he can't trust, right? He can't see his dad's face. He keeps skipping time in the psychiatrist room. They keep losing bits and he keeps flashing back to the kitchen scene where he blew up the kitchen with his brain and trying to skip over that. And it's a very difficult thing to wrap your brain around. In addition to all of the weirdness going on at Summerland, we get some flashbacks to David and Lenny outside of their institutionalized life, right? They're on the streets, she's pushing around a big stove, and it's a weird moment, right? He comes out of his therapy session, he sees Lenny pushing around a giant stove, and my initial reaction was, okay, this is another hallucination somehow, but the show actually kind of zags on you and explains it in a way that I think, for me anyway, I believe that this is actually a thing that happened, right? David and Lenny somehow knew each other before they were institutionalized, and she's taking this giant stove to sell to drug dealer Tony Shalhoub for drugs. It's absurd, admittedly, but it's absurd in a way that you could buy that her character would do, that she would trade this whole giant stove for a little bit of this hit of drugs that her and David in particular really should not be stacking on top of his medicine. But it's an interesting way to have her show up in this episode. She does appear in a little bit of a flashback as well. And Lenny, for me, is becoming one of the grounding characters in the show because I feel like we can be pretty confident that she does or did exist in a real way. And her popping back up like this, showing up in his memory and kind of giving us this flashback of her and him getting high, and of course then it again turns out to be sort of a memory scan, and we also get a literal like brain scan thing happening later. All of this stuff really kind of gives me the chance to latch onto her as a character and just someone who's been caught up in David's wake. She is crazy, right? She doesn't have some other powers, at least as far as we can tell, as far as you can tell anything for sure on this show. But here she is. She's, it almost adds to the tragedy, right, of what has happened to her. She somehow got sucked up with David into the institution. She gets, the first episode gets her killed, and now we're seeing more of her backstory, and we're going to see her as this voice of conscience for David going forward of, hey, you killed me. Hey, you're not okay. Maybe you should listen to these people that are telling you to tap into all this raw power. Maybe there's a good reason that you fragmented yourself into a bunch of pieces that don't realize that they're a bunch of pieces of yourself. Maybe that's a thing. Speaking of the brain scan, though, I just got to once again give a huge shout out to the production design on this show. David goes into this MRI machine and he's getting scanned, and the tech here is so in your face, awesomely weird. Like electropunk, if that's a thing. I browse occasionally the retro battle stations subreddit on Reddit. These guys that post all of these sort of old machines that they have, older Apples, older, Commodore 64s, and seeing these giant banks of like blinking light type computers and huge cathode ray tubes that are sort of just nakedly out in the wild. All of this stuff kind of thrown together in a way that, again, gives you a sense of disconnection from the real world in this show. And I hope, despite the fact that I think a lot of this stuff is filtered through David's memories, right? Despite the fact that it may not all be real, I really do hope that the show doesn't come to a point where it switches to the real world and gives us like, okay, yes, but things are really like this, and gives us sort of the gritty version. I like the idea that we are in a universe where something like this could happen, where the tech isn't, it doesn't look like our tech. It does the same stuff more or less, but we're not living in the same world. And this great sort of offshoot parallel universe that they're living in, if the production design is to be believed, is fascinating to me. I talked about how that Lenny has become an element that I sort of hold on to and say, okay, this is a real thing. This is definitely a real character. The other element that I'm starting to grab onto is the man in the green suit, who we have a name for now. He's called the Eye. And he is a little bit less prominent in this particular episode than he was in the previous episode, but I think at this point we can all definitely say that he is not a hallucination. He is not a memory implant. This guy is probably some kind of real thing. That we can assume that he represents a real threat to David, that there are real government agents coming after him. They really do capture his sister, which is sort of at the climax of this episode, right? David gets a breakthrough. He's in this MRI machine. And by the way, just a quick shout out to the transitions of the MRI machine going down over his head and swiping to memories that the MRI is trying to uncover, right? But he sees her when he's inside of this being abducted essentially by these thugs, these, people who are led by the Eye. And at the end of the episode, we see them holding her and doing something with some water with some weird worms inside. I don't know what that's about, but it's obviously not good. It's not. It doesn't look like she's about to have a fun time with that guy in that room and that liquid and those worms in that liquid. And you get a great moment between David and Sid where she's asking him not to leave, right? Like David's ready to ride off into the sunset and be the hero and save his sister. And Sydney comes up to him and says, listen, you're not good to her like this. You can't help her if you don't finish the work. We can save her together if you'd finish the work. Because if my theory is correct, the work is getting all of these personalities, maybe not to coalesce exactly, but getting David to a point where he can understand who all of these personalities are and how they interact, they are a part of him, and come to grips with his own reality of what he is, of who he is, of what his power is. And it's interesting too, because again, I don't think any of the individual pieces understands the full extent of what is going on with him. If this theory is correct, if the memory guy is a separate part of David's psyche, the memory guy doesn't know about the yellow-eyed demon. The memory guy doesn't understand all of this weird trauma that David went to, despite the fact that he says he remembers his birth. He remembers, everything that he ever went through. He talks about how his father couldn't remember things and he would snap his fingers. And now that I'm thinking about that, I don't know how that fits in with my theory of him and David being the same person, because David does remember his father, and his father, as far as we know, wasn't in a war and didn't lose his memory. And I don't know. This show, it's so slippery. I said this last week, but it's so unbelievably difficult to get a bead on. And that's really something that I'm coming to love about it. It's not easily definable, but there are answers there. You can see the shape of the answers sort of lurking like shadows under the water, and they're coming up at you, and you're a little bit horrified of them, but you're also like curious to see what they look like. That's how I feel when I'm watching this show. And there's these great moments of humor and horror and beauty all just mixed together. And it's so weird. And I like that. I like that a lot. Anyway, guys, that's all I've got for this week. If you like these recaps, click that subscribe button. I'll be doing them every week. I need a chart or something. I saw the comment from last week talking about, can we get a chart? And man, I need a chart. I need the levels of dream world / flashback / memory. Somebody get to drawing that. I'm not doing it because it's way too late for me. I am looking forward to things growing a little clearer as we go on. But until they do, I'm Albert, and I'll see you next week with another episode of the Human Echoes Recap.